I didn't mean to overhear them. I was only walking toward the dining room to ask if anyone wanted more tea. Then, I heard my daughter's voice. Clear, sharp, almost annoyed. Honestly, he's dead weight. For a moment, I thought she must be talking about someone else. Maybe a coworker. Maybe a neighbor. But then she said my name, and everything inside me went quiet. I stood there in the hallway, just outside the dining room. The door was slightly open. Light spilled across the floor, and I could see the shadows of my daughter and her husband sitting at the table. My hands were still, holding the teapot. Steam rose slowly into the air. He barely does anything. Anymore, my daughter continued. He just sits in that chair all day. Her husband chuckled softly. Well, he is 74. My daughter sighed. That's exactly the problem. Something inside my chest tightened. Not anger, not yet, just a heavy kind of disbelief, because the woman saying those words was the same little girl who used to run into my arms every evening when I came home from work, the same girl who once cried for an hour because I missed her school, play the same girl who held my hand at her mother's funeral, and now she was sitting 10 feet away from me, talking about me like I was an inconvenience. I stayed there for another minute, long enough to hear one more sentence. Honestly, she said, lowering her voice, once the house is in our name, things will be easier. The teapot in my hand suddenly felt very heavy. I quietly turned around and walked back to my room. I have lived in that house for 42 years. It is not a large house, just 2 floors. A small garden in the back, and a front porch where my wife used to grow roses. But every wall carries a memory. I bought that house when I was 32 years old, back then. My daughter Emily was only 4. My wife, Margaret, stood beside me when we signed the papers. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "This will be our forever home." And for many years, it was when Emily grew up running through those hallways. She learned to ride her bicycle on the street outside. She studied at the kitchen table while Margaret prepared dinner, and every night we sat together in the dining room. The same dining room where I had just heard my daughter call me dead weight. Margaret passed away 12 years ago. Cancer. It came quietly, and it left quickly. The house became very quiet after that. For the first few years, it was just me. Emily lived 2 states away then. She visited on holidays, called once a week, and always told me not to worry about being alone, but life has a strange way of changing direction. 3 years ago, Emily called me with excitement in her voice. "Dad," she said, "Mark got a job offer in your city." Mark was her husband. "Really?" I said, "Yes. We're thinking about moving." I remember smiling. When she said that, the house felt too quiet. Sometimes, so I told her exactly what any father would. Say you're always welcome here. That's how it started. They moved into the guest room at first, just temporarily. They said only until we find our own place. But months passed, then a year, then another. Somehow the arrangement became permanent at first. I didn't mind Emily cooked dinner most nights. Mark helped fix things around the house. The place felt alive again, but slowly. Things began to change. Small things. At first, Emily started rearranging furniture without asking. Mark replaced the locks on the back door. Then they began talking about renovations. We should modernize the kitchen, Mark said one evening. I asked. Well, he laughed. It'll increase the value of the house. I remember nodding politely, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy still. I said nothing, because when you are a parent, you often choose peace over confrontation, even when your instincts whisper warnings. About 6 months ago, Emily brought up the subject of paperwork. We were sitting at the kitchen table. She placed a small folder in front of me. "Dad," she said gently, "we've been thinking about the future." That word always makes people nervous. The future. What about it? I asked. Well, the house. I felt my shoulders stiffen. What about the house? Mark leaned forward. It would just make things easier if the house was already in Emily's name. I looked at both of them. Neither one met my eyes. Emily spoke again. It's just legal stuff, Dad. Estate planning. Had spent 40 years working as an accountant. I know how paperwork works. I know how ownership works, and I know when someone is pretending. Something is simple when it isn't. So I smiled. Politely. I'll think about it. Emily seemed relieved. Mark nodded. But after that day, the conversation kept returning. Every few weeks, always gentle, always casual. Did you have a chance to look at those documents? Just routine paperwork. Nothing complicated. Eventually, I told them I would review everything. And I did. Carefully. Very carefully, because numbers and contracts were my profession for most of my life, which is exactly why I understood something my daughter didn't realize. Those documents would give them complete ownership of the house immediately, not after I passed away now. That was the moment I stopped being naive, but I also said nothing. Instead, I quietly placed the documents back into the folder and waited. Sometimes the most powerful move a person can make is patience. The night I overheard them at the dinner table changed everything. Not because of the paperwork. I already understood their plan. No, what changed was hearing the way my daughter spoke about me dead weight. Those two words stayed with me the entire night. I sat in my bedroom chair for hours. The house was silent, and I thought about Margaret. My wife always had a way of understanding people, even when I did once, many years ago. She told me something I never forgot. Arthur, she said, the way people treat you when they think you're powerless tells you everything. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant, but that night, sitting alone in my room, I finally did. Emily believed I was weak, old, dependent, she thought. I would eventually sign those papers and quietly step aside. What she didn't know was that earlier that same week, I had already made a phone call. A very important one. To someone who understood contracts even better than I did, my lawyer. And what we discussed during that meeting was something my daughter and her husband would never see coming. The meeting with my lawyer happened 3 days before that dinner. His name is Daniel Harper. I have known him for nearly 25 years. Back when I was still working as an accountant, many of my clients needed legal advice. Daniel handled most of those cases. Over the years, we became friends. Not the kind who call each other every week, but the kind who understand each other without many words. When I walked into his office that morning, he immediately noticed something was wrong. Arthur, he said, standing up from behind his desk, you look like a man carrying a heavy question. Smiled faintly. Suppose I am. He sat down. I placed Emily's folder of documents on the desk. Daniel opened it slowly and began reading. He didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. The room was quiet except for the soft turning of paper. Then he leaned back in his chair. Well, he said calmly, this is very straightforward. I waited. He tapped the papers lightly. If you sign these documents, your daughter and her husband become the legal owners of your house immediately. I nodded. That's what I thought. Daniel studied my face. Did they tell you that? Not exactly. He folded his hands. What did they say? That it was just estate planning. Daniel sighed softly. Arthur, estate planning usually happens after someone passes away. This is a transfer of ownership. Understand that. He looked at me carefully. Then, I assume you're not planning to sign it, I thought. About Emily for a moment. The little girl with the missing front teeth, the teenager who cried when she failed her driving test, the young bride who asked me to walk her down the aisle. I don't want to sign it, I said quietly, but I also don't want a war in my house. Daniel nodded slowly. Then you need a strategy. That word stayed in my mind, strategy. Numbers. had always made sense to me. Numbers follow rules. People are more complicated. Daniel leaned forward. "Tell me something honestly," he said. "Do you believe your daughter understands what these documents actually do?" I thought for a moment. "I believe her husband does." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Ah, yes." Mark had always been polite, but there was something about him that felt calculated. The way he asked questions about the house, the way he talked about property values, the way he often reminded Emily that this place could be worth a lot one day. Daniel closed the folder. "Well," he said calmly, "if they want to play with paperwork, we can also play with paperwork." I couldn't help smiling slightly. "And what does that mean?" "It means," he said, "you don't refuse immediately." I listened carefully. "You let them believe their plan is working. And then we show them something they didn't expect." For the next hour, we discussed several options. Some were simple, others were more creative. But in the end, we chose a plan that was both legal and very clear. Daniel prepared several documents, not the ones Emily brought. New ones, very different ones. When he finished explaining everything, he looked at me seriously. "Arthur," he said, "this will protect you completely. But you need to stay calm and patient." I nodded. "I've had practice." Before leaving his office, I asked him one final question. "Daniel, do you think my daughter is trying to take advantage of me?" He didn't answer right away. Lawyers are careful with words. Finally, he said, something simple. "I think your daughter trusts the wrong person." That answer stayed with me. Over the following days, I watched carefully. When you stop assuming the best in people, you begin noticing things you missed before. Emily, talked about the house often, usually when they thought I wasn't paying attention. One evening, I walked into the living room and heard Mark speaking quietly. "Once the transfer is done, we can refinance." Emily sounded uncertain. "Are you sure that's necessary?" "It's just smart financial. Planning Dad might not like that." Mark laughed. Softly, "He won't have a choice." They didn't see me standing in the hallway. They didn't notice how still I had become. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. 2 days later, Emily approached me again. I was sitting in my usual chair near the window. The afternoon sunlight filled the room. "Dad," she said gently, sitting beside me, "did you have time to review the documents?" I lifted her face. For a moment, I saw the little girl again, and my heart softened. But then I remembered the words from the dining room. "Dead weight." "Yes," I said calmly. "And I think we should discuss them together." Her face brightened. "Oh, good. Mark can explain everything. That would be helpful." "Be tonight at dinner?" I nodded slowly. "Tonight is fine." Emily stood up, clearly relieved as she walked away. I noticed something interesting. She never asked what I thought about the documents, only whether I had reviewed them. It seemed the answer she wanted was already decided in her mind. That evening, dinner was unusually cheerful. Emily cooked roast chicken. Mark opened a bottle of wine. They both seemed relaxed, confident, as if the future had already been settled. We ate quietly for a while. Then Mark cleared his throat. "So Arthur," he said with a friendly smile, "did everything in the documents make sense?" I wiped my mouth with a napkin. "Yes," I said calmly. "Very clear?" Emily looked relieved. "See," she said. "I told you it was simple." Mark leaned forward slightly. "If you're comfortable, we can sign everything tomorrow." I looked at him then, at Emily. I actually had a different idea. "What kind of idea?" Emily asked. I folded my hands on the table. "I thought it would be best if we reviewed everything with my lawyer." Mark's smile froze. "Your lawyer?" "Yes." Emily looked confused. "Why would we need a lawyer?" "Just to make sure everything is handled properly." Mark spoke quickly. "It's really not necessary." I remained calm. I already scheduled a meeting. Silence filled the room. Mark's jaw tightened slightly. "When?" "Friday morning." Lily glanced nervously at her husband. "Dad, That seems a little excessive. I smiled gently. Emily, you said this was important for the future. She nodded slowly. Yes. Then it deserves careful attention. Neither of them argued further, but the mood at the table changed. Something had shifted. For the first time, they realized the situation might not be as simple as they believed. Later that night, I sat alone in my room again, but this time, I did not feel heavy. I felt calm, because the next step of the plan was already in motion. And on Friday morning, when we walked into Daniel Harper's office together, my daughter and her husband were about to learn something they never expected, something that would completely change their understanding of the house. And of me. Friday morning arrived colder than usual. The sky was gray, and the air had that quiet stillness that comes before rain. Emily and Mark drove us to the lawyer's office. Mark insisted on it. He said it would be easier for everyone. The ride there was quiet. Emily looked out the window most of the time. Mark kept both hands on the steering wheel, his jaw tight, his eyes focused straight ahead. I simply watched the road pass by. When you reach a certain age, silence becomes familiar. It doesn't feel uncomfortable anymore. Sometimes silence is where the truth waits. Daniel Harper's office was on the third floor of a brick building downtown. I had already told him what time we would arrive when we stepped into the office. His assistant greeted us and led us into a conference room. Daniel walked in a minute later carrying a folder. He shook my hand first. Good to see you again, Arthur. Then he nodded politely at Emily and Mark. And you must be the family. We all sat down. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Daniel placed the folder on the table, he said calmly, I understand there are some documents to review. Mark quickly slid Emily's folder across the table. Yes, he said, just a simple property transfer. Daniel opened the folder and began reading. Again. He took his time, page by page. The silence stretched. Emily shifted in her chair. Mark crossed his arms. Finally, Daniel closed the folder. Well, he said slowly, these documents would transfer full ownership of Arthur's house to Emily immediately. Emily nodded. That's right. Daniel looked at her carefully, and Arthur would no longer legally own property. Mark leaned forward, yes, but he would still live there, of course. Daniel's eyes moved from Mark. To me, Arthur, he said, is that your understanding as well? I folded my hands on the table. Yes. Mark smiled confidently. So we're all clear then. Daniel paused. Then he opened the second folder, the one he had prepared earlier. Actually, he said calmly, Arthur asked me to prepare something as well. Mark frowned slightly. What do you mean? Daniel slid several documents across the table. These are the finalized papers for the Harper Family Living Trust. Emily blinked. A trust. Daniel nodded. Yes. Arthur transferred the ownership of the house into a protected trust 3 days ago. Mark's expression changed immediately. What does that mean? Daniel spoke in the steady voice lawyers use when explaining something very simple. It means the house no longer belongs directly to Arthur. Emily looked confused. Then who owns it? Daniel placed a finger gently on the document. The trust owns it. And who controls the trust? Mark asked quickly. Daniel looked at me. Arthur does. The room went quiet. Mark leaned back slowly. So the transfer papers. They're useless now. Daniel nodded. Correct. Emily looked at me. Dad, why would you do that? Her voice sounded hurt, not angry, just confused. I met her eyes because it protects the house. Mark spoke sharply. Protects it from who? I answered quietly. From anyone who might try to take it. Silence filled the room again. Daniel continued explaining. The trust allows Arthur to live in the house for the rest of his life. No one can sell it, refinance it, or transfer it without his permission. Mark's face had turned pale, and after he dies. He asked. Daniel turned another page. After Arthur's passing, the house will be sold. Emily looked relieved for a moment, but Daniel continued. and the proceeds will be divided between 3 beneficiaries. Emily frowned. 3. Yes, he read from the document. 1/3 to Emily Carter. Emily nodded slowly. Another third, Daniel continued. To the Margaret Lewis Cancer Foundation. Emily's eyes widened. And the final third. Daniel paused. To Arthur's nephew, Daniel Brooks. Mark stared at the paper. Your nephew? I nodded. Yes. Daniel Brooks was my sister's son, the same nephew who had visited me every weekend after Margaret died. The same young man who once offered to move in and help when I was recovering from surgery. The same young man who never once asked about money, only about how I was feeling. Emily looked stunned. Dad, why would you give part of the house to Daniel? I spoke gently. Because he never treated me like a burden. Those words hung quietly in the room. Mark said nothing. For the first time since I had known him, he had no response. Daniel Harper closed the folder. The trust is legally binding and cannot be changed without Arthur's consent. Emily looked down at the table. Her voice was softer now. You thought we were trying to take advantage of. You? I took a deep breath. No, I said quietly. I heard you trying. I met her eyes calmly. The night before I called Daniel, I heard you at the dinner table. Her face slowly lost its color. You said something that stayed with me. What did I say? I answered gently. You called me dead weight. The room became completely silent. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Mark looked away. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Emily whispered, I didn't know you heard that. I know. She wiped her eyes. I didn't mean it like that. I nodded. Slowly, but you said it like that. Daniel Harper quietly gathered the papers. He understood this conversation no longer needed. Lawyer. The ride home was even quieter than the ride there. No one turned on the radio. No one spoke. When we reached the house, Emily went straight to her room. Mark stayed in the kitchen for a moment. He looked at me. For once, his confidence was gone. You really planned all of this, he said. I shrugged gently. I protected what your plan tried to take. He didn't respond. He simply walked away. Emily came to my room later that night. She sat in the same chair where she used to sit as a child. Dad, she said softly. I'm sorry. I believed her. But some words cannot be unheard. Some truths cannot be forgotten. I love you. Emily, I told her. But respect matters. Nodded slowly. I understand. Mark moved out 2 months later. Their marriage did not survive the silence that followed. Emily still visits me. Now, sometimes we drink tea on the porch, like we used. Too many years ago, the house is quiet again. But this time, it feels peaceful as I've grown older. I've learned something important. People often assume that age means weakness. They believe quiet people are powerless. But experience is a kind of strength, and dignity is a kind of armor. So, if there is one thing I would tell anyone listening to this story, it is this. Never underestimate the calm person in the room, because the quietest person is often the one who already understands everything.